Okay, so here we go into one of the largest questions that anyone that studies religion has to address at some point, and that is the question of the existence of God. And obviously, when you look at the idea of rational and faith-based approaches, if you have an experience of God, if you have literally had an experience of your own faith, this isn't a question that you're going to answer rationally. You will answer it from your experience or from your own faith. So the existence of God can be argued, as Luther comes at it, from the experience of faith. And that's impossible to argue with because it simply is experiential and belief-based. Interestingly, the idea that God does not exist, although it engages a lot more scientific thinking and rational thinking, it's also a belief. It's based on assumptions about that we can get to truth through observation, through scientific method. And so these are just different ways of coming at the world. Do you approach the world through reason, through intellectual inquiry, or do you approach it through intuition and feelings and belief? And there's no right answer there. There's just simply different approaches. But there are ways that thinkers have approached the idea of God in a rational way. And that begins all the way back with Aristotle. Now, Aristotle argued that everything in the world moves. The world is in movement. And if you go back through time, developments, if you want to think about evolution as an example or the emergence of the universe, at some point, that motion had to be initiated. So the prime mover, God, if you will, if you look at the dominoes over there, is the initiator of that action. God is the force that drives things to come into being. So that's the idea of the creator. The creator is the first mover. So the way that Aristotle puts it in the excerpt that many of you read is that basically the process of movement must eventually come to an end so that the prime mover or the first mover is God. And so if you want to think about that scientifically, that means that God is the initiator of the Big Bang, the thing that causes the creation to come into being in the first place. So that's a more traditional way of thinking about what creation is in a kind of more Western way, more Christian way. Maimonides, some of you know, is a Jewish philosopher from the late Middle Ages, and he argues that we really can't understand what God is. We are human beings. Again, to quote him, God is a being to whom none of Adonai's creatures is similar, who has nothing in common with them, who does not include plurality. In other words, way too big and way too abstract for human beings to understand in a kind of a literal sense. And that's one reason, by the way, why Jews don't depict God, because God is too big to be depicted. So obviously the depiction on the left, which is actually based on a Blake poem, is a Christian depiction, as are the ones that you saw on the previous slide. But if you follow the Christian thinking and you think, okay, well, are there other ways that you can come to the idea of the existence of God? Well, Pascal argues that you can just by reasonable inquiry. Think about it for a second. You've got two choices. You can believe in God, and if you're right, as it suggests in the upper left-hand corner, you get to heaven and you experience eternal joy and you experience that oneness with God and you have a relationship with that creator and your life is better both during your life and certainly after your life. And if you're wrong, well, you wasted some Sunday mornings and you listen to some music that you might not have particularly have liked, but really nothing will happen to you. Now, the atheist is betting on the fact that there is nothing, right? And so if the atheist is right, well, congratulations, you die and nothing happens. But if you're wrong, there is a huge price to pay. So if you look at this in a cost-benefit analysis, a very simple cost-benefit analysis, it makes more sense to believe because the cost is very low and the benefit is very high. And if you look at the cost-benefit analysis from an atheist position, The cost is potentially extremely high. And again, this is looking at joy and suffering in a very Christian sort of dual way of heaven and hell. But if you want to think about it another way, does the belief in God bring you a more fulfilled and wholesome life? So if you want to look at this modified, there have been plenty of studies showing that people who have religious beliefs and are engaged in communities with religion have community, have higher levels of gratitude, have a sense of that they're loved by something bigger than they are, have generally lower blood pressure and healthier habits of mind, and lower rates of drug and alcohol use, and generally a little bit higher levels of confidence. Now, you can argue that a lot of these things could be replaced by other non-religious things, and that's true, but you have to self-consciously find those things and create those things if you're gonna live that kind of life. So even if you start a meditation practice, there's a whole lot of positive things that would happen there. Now, you could say meditation doesn't require a belief in God. Anyway, the point is that religious practice factually and scientifically leads to better health outcomes on its own. Yes, it can be replaced, but religion certainly is good for you, right? And if you don't act religiously, what do you get exactly? Maybe the belief that your ideas are important, or some sense of intellectual independence. You may think you're just right, and that may provide something for you as well. So Pascal's wager is pretty simple. Belief is rational. So there are many other ways to look at religious belief, and many of them engage these types of questions, right? So God is prime mover is the Aristotle argument. God is the force of change is a little bit like looking at not just the initiation of the movement, but all of the things that develop as a result of it, right? So if you think about potential of the beauty of the natural world, that is a potential that has been realized. Now you could say, well, that's just evolution, but then you've got to look at evolution in kind of miraculous terms, that it can create the kind of beauty and complexity that we see. So intelligent design is the belief that you simply can't explain a world as beautiful and as complex as ours, and a universe as complex as ours, without getting into some sort of intentional design. So if you look at the structure of DNA, scientists can't explain the existence of DNA simply in evolutionary terms. Yes, evolution can explain it to a point, but DNA has a complexity that's hard to describe and hard to justify within the time frame and the existence of evolution. The Cambrian explosion 530 million years ago also, why did all of this life suddenly emerge? Scientists have a hard time explaining that. Look at things like the human eye, or even the structure of the universe itself, with all of the universal constants that have to be exactly perfectly tuned in order for us to even be here, and for you to even be listening to me and understanding, if you're understanding any of this. You have a brain that's extremely sophisticated, that is hard to understand simply as a result of a long time frame of random chance going from a cell to something as complex as the human brain. So our world is dynamic, ordered, and interconnected. That interconnection must come from something. So that's kind of an extension of the intelligent design argument. The idea that intelligence is a product of intelligence, that human intelligence specifically must come from something of equal intelligence, that intelligence doesn't come from cells. Intelligence comes from something bigger than that. So again, the idea of God from an aesthetic perspective, the idea of perfection and infinity, you can understand that sometimes by looking up into the sky or looking across the ocean. The concept of infinity only exists if we're capable of thinking along the lines of the being that created us. That's the way that would work, that argument. Moral law is an interesting one, right? Without God, there would be no absolute moral law. So if you believe in moral principles, murder is bad, you should respect your parents, you should listen to your teachers. That's not a moral law, but it should be. These are things that depend on absolutes. And if you believe in absolutes, then you have to question where they come from. Spiritual desire is more of an emotional argument. Those of you that might feel that you are from another world or you are longing for that, where does that longing come from? Well, that comes from God. Aesthetic experience is really simple. When you listen to a beautiful piece of music or you're out in nature or you see something that's tremendously beautiful, it just brings you that emotional feeling of what God is. So again, more of a feeling-based argument. And then the experience of the divine and the numinous, which you've already talked about. So can God's existence be discovered through logic and reason? Perhaps, if you're an intellectual and you think about all these things and you come to that conclusion, yes. And there have been people like Pascal who've gotten to God through reason. For the most part, I think, though, that God, it makes more sense for more people to get through it through emotion. But the important piece here is you can make arguments for God through reason, and has been done in the past, and it's worth thinking about. So we are going to be throwing around a lot of these ideas in class. Hopefully this gave you a little bit of an introduction to some of those ideas, and we'll be talking about it soon.